It's 2016. My parents and I visit the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, and we see this. I was shocked beyond belief. I just walked through a whole museum of Impressionist, Baroque, and Minimalist art. And now this? What was it about? What could it be about? Why is it here? This is totally different. Should I even think of this? Even though abstract art is typically thought of as bodiless, I was left with a similar feeling of not knowing what to think or how to talk about this work. The paintings did contain a human face, but they maintained a layer of abstraction that separated the viewer from the person depicted. To a person not in the art scene at the time, surrounded by other people not in the art scene at the time, these were just images that brought up the carried-in emotions and reactions one might have towards, quote, obvious, unquote, trans women. Instead of an educational, fulfilling experience, viewing the paintings was a trigger for an awkward conversation with my family. After this, I became obsessed with Andy and his work. Being the queer adolescent who lacked queer role models, I studied him as well as others, and expanded into the, quote, fine arts, end quote, scene in general. But that's a long story, and I won't tell it. So, let's fast forward and talk a little bit about what I think about this piece now. It's 2018. My partner and I visit the Andy Warhol Museum on a Saturday. What a coincidence! The same paintings that I say sucked me into the art scene. After doing some more research and coming back more educated, I learned this. Some of the women that are depicted in these paintings were faced with incredibly difficult lives, which included, but not limited to, police brutality, street harassment, discrimination, violence, and even cold-blooded murder. One of the subjects, Marsha P. Johnson, was fundamental to the trans queer struggle for legal recognition and protection in the 1960s to the 1990s. From looking at these paintings, would you know that? Warhol did not include a description or even bother to get to know some of these people before he took images to then convert into paintings. In making these paintings, he did bring an image of queerness into the mainstream, but failed to create a meaningful dialogue between the viewer and the subject, which is an ongoing problem for trans people of color today. With Andy operating at such a high level of abstraction, it makes the viewer clueless to much of the backstory behind the work, relying on their ability to access information about the work on their own. Abstraction was a key tactic that postmodernist thought employed. Michael Fried, an art influencer at the time, stated that an art object's need for intimate relation was caused to banish it from the realm of art to taking it seriously. Now, newer cultural critics such as David Getsy are encouraging the expansion of the queer visual language, or the way in which queer art is presented, into more abstract art. Gordon Hall cites the cause for this expansion as the glitter problem. Hall describes it as the following. Often, artwork is described as queer when it depicts LGBT subjects or figures, is produced by a self-identified LGBT person, or references gay culture through recognizable motifs, references, or aesthetics. As artists during Warhol's lifetime, as well as after it, have used queer bodies and specific materials, such as yarn, glitter, bodily fluids, etc., in order to represent queerness, these materials can be limiting in that they only allow a certain type of embodiment or form. A couple of artists that have expanded this language effectively into more abstract realms include Gordon Hall as well as Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who have, to an extent, queered and explored queerness in minimalist sculpture. For example, in Hall's work, The Number of Inches Between Them, we see a clear departure from the typical minimalist sculpture. Everyone who enters the exhibit can read a letter by Hall addressed to the original creator of the sculpture, Dennis Croteau, effectively creating an opening in which viewers can peek into the mindset of the artist and their influences. On the other hand, Felix Gonzalez-Torres uses a common emotional sentiment in an awful circumstance to charge the two clocks he places side by side in Untitled, Perfect Lovers. In creating these works, these abstract artists work well in overcoming the confinations of the queer aesthetic and flip the relationships that many of the abstract works have instated before. They do it intentionally and carefully, making sure to give clear references and tactile thought that outside viewers can understand and that can complicate the relationship of a viewer with abstract art, and that there is an intention of having an effect of relationality or intimacy. Now, on a different note, an interesting example that could be relevant to this discourse is Darby English's studies in 1971, A Year in the Life of Color. English discusses two shows that were exhibited in 1971 that included black artists that avoided the representational, non-abstract politics that was the majority of black expression at the time. Many saw these events as an intercultural, integrational effort of black artists into modernist art. English says, a commitment to modernism did more than simply escape the representationalist, collectivist, black ideological norm. Working largely without a polemic against a relentlessly expressive formation, i.e., the current black style of expression, they occupied a paradoxical situation. That being said, this situation does not necessarily translate to the queer struggle of representation or abstraction, but I do believe that queer artists pushing into more abstract spaces will not only fix the glitter problem, but create a complication similar to that seen in the two shows English discusses. Now, to tie this all together, here are some closing thoughts. Andy Warhol's work, like many artists of his time, keeps a layer of abstraction between viewer, subject, and artist. In doing so, I argue that Warhol's work that inhabits the queer realm suffers from its abstraction, including viewers outside of the art world. Now, newer cultural critics, such as Getsy, are pushing for the queer form to be dispersed into the realm of abstract minimalist sculpture, citing a glitter problem, or that queer art now has a strict language. Finally, we see English's studies in Black modernist abstraction as an example of what could happen if queer art moves more into this realm. We see that abstraction can be effective and powerful, as seen in Hall's and Gonzalez-Torres' work, but it can also be ineffective and even problematic. For all in the art world, queer art marks something that flips the normal on its head. It represents lives, experiences, and embodiments that have yet to come, or that are staking a claim in the here and now. Abstraction and representation are tools for this, but we must be intentional, careful, and most importantly, queer in using each. While keeping in mind the 18-year-old boys who wander into the art museum with their families, as well as all queer folk not in the art world, let us push into the future of queerness, keeping its essence of radical inclusion, fucked norms, and new horizons.